Okay, great. So Keith was asking me before how I got into this, and what happened was a couple of months ago, I cruise YouTube all the time, and a YouTube video popped up by Dan Fox that said ISO on Sony cameras is incredibly misunderstood. I'm like, oh, really? I have a Sony camera. Let me watch this. And sure enough, some of the things that I thought were all about ISO and high noise weren't. And I learned something from it. So I started doing some more research and watching more videos and reading articles. And Doug and I do an awful lot of high ISO work and figured I should really understand where this noise is coming from and what I can do about it. So tonight we'll talk a little about physics, talk about photons, we'll do a little math. We'll talk about how photons end up as files, what noise is and where it comes from. A little bit about how noise affects ISO and dynamic range, and then a few strategies for capture and post-processing. Let me go to how do I go to my next slide here? That's not going to work. So the common knowledge that I had was ISO increases the sensitivity of the sensor, and therefore how darker or lighter your images would be. And what I found was, no, that doesn't work. So I went to Adobe. They created Lightroom and Photoshop. They should know what they're talking about. And it says ISO controls the amount of light your camera lets in. Well, I already know that's not correct. It's one third of the exposure triangle, but no, that's not right. So we're talking about noise. We're talking about this image on the right. It was taken at 6400 ISO. You see some of this background here that's dirtier than what we see here. Her face has splotches on it that we don't see in the processed image. And here we get back to, in the beginning, there was light. So let's just talk about foundationally here. Light is photons. Photons are the smallest particles of electronic energy. They tend to travel in waves. They're created by stars, by man-made light, some animals. They're not consistent. They tend to be random. These waves have random photons in them. And when it gets down to us as photographers, what we see is we have a light source that bounces off a subject and ends up in our camera. But in reality, we have a light source that bounces off our subject, bounces off plants and bushes and the ground and clouds, and ends up in our camera. And bright surfaces tend to reflect more photons where dark surfaces absorb them. And we take an image like this, and first of all, in this image, the lighting isn't everywhere. It's directed on our subjects. And you can notice that the bright surfaces reflect more light than the dark surfaces do. We're getting more photons reflected towards our camera in the lighter areas than the darker image. Now, when we look at analog film cameras, what happens is the photons interact directly with the chemicals in the film. And then we go to a dark room and we add some more chemicals that enhances the process, and we add more chemicals that fixes the process. When there aren't enough photons hitting the film to produce a sharper, recognizable image, especially in the darks, there's noise in film we refer to as grain. And that lack of data, that lack of photons, has parallels to why there's noise in digital cameras. And that's what we're here today to talk about. And here's where I had to throw this in. Technology sufficiently advanced is indistinguishable from magic. And when I look at what's happening in my digital camera, I'm going, all right, I'm sorry. This is just magic that you can make this happen. Here's the process in digital camera. We have photons that are reflected from our subject. They go to a sensor that throws out electrons. They go to an amplifier. Then they're converted from an analog image to a digital image, ones and zeros, that ends up as our saved image or our file. What happens to those photons is before they end up in the sensor, they go through, in a color camera, they go through micro lenses that feed blue, red, RGB, red, green, and blue photons, allow them to get through to what's called a photosite. And here's where the things are crazy. In a 50 megabyte camera, 50 megapixel camera, we have 50 million of these things. But here's how essentially they work. A photon hits the photodiode at the top. For every photon that hits the photodiode, it releases an electron that gets captured into a well and effectively counts them. And all the photodiode is a sophisticated abacus. All it is doing is counting electrons. So whether your cycle is 1/10 of a second or 1/1000th of a second, it captures electrons. It releases those electrons at the end of that 1/10 of a second, 1/100th of a second, and that charge is measured by the circuit. And then the photosite is reset for the next 1/10 of a second, 1/1000th of a second. All this happens in the blink of an eye. And in this case, what we're talking about is electrons are representing photons. So that's all happening here in the sensor. Now, if we look at this that we're all familiar with, the histogram, we talk about this as pixel counts. And pixel counts really are photodiode counts. They're electron counts. And what we see here is that the more photons, the more electrons that are captured, the brighter the image, right? The more photons you get reflected from your subject, the more brighter it is. The fewer electrons, you get your darker image. So we have an image like this. And what we see here is lots of blues and greens that are captured by those blue and green photos that have gone through the filters and now captured by those photosites. And cumulatively, we see how their luminance is captured here. And if we went beyond this right-hand side, the bright side, we blow out an image and all you'd see is white, as we know. And on the other side, the dark side, if we have literally no photons or fewer photons, we're not even going to see the image. So this is reflective of what our photosites are capturing. Any electronic device produces some degree of background electronic interference. We'll call that a background hum. That's the primary source of noise in a digital camera. There's also a minute amount of noise from random photons, but really the main source of noise is the electronics that are in the camera themselves. And when you think about this, you think about a stereo. If you turn the amplifier up on a stereo in the quiet areas of music, you can sometimes hear that background hum. That's this interference I'm talking about. And what you see here at the bottom of the screen is represents the noise that's produced by the camera. And this represents that background image that's being captured from our subject. And when the photon capture is low enough that it mixes with the noise due to the electrons of the camera and those random photons, you actually see that noise. Now, if we can boost the signal, we get more photons, and we have an increased what we call signal to noise ratio. Eventually what happens is the data that we're capturing covers that noise and we don't see it. And that's kind of why we don't see as much noise in the brighter parts of an image. And the noise we do see tends to be in the darker parts of the image. So here's another way of looking at it. Here's the sensor well in the photosite. The red line represents the base level of noise produced by the camera. And the wavy line is pretty much a dark image that's intermixing a little bit with that noise. Now, if we can boost the light that the photosite is capturing, getting more photons, ultimately we end up hiding that noise. So here, this image, if you can see on her chest, there's this bright image. It's got a lot of reflected photons. Here in the darker parts of her face, we don't. And what we end up seeing here is a lot of noise in her face, very little noise in the bright areas, very little noise up here. And then here's a processed image after it's gone through Lightroom, denoise, taking some of that away. So we as photographers have control of three things. We have control of the aperture, which is depth of field. We can control the shutter speed, which is how much blur, how long whatever. And both of those will also affect the amount of light that's hitting the photodiode. And then the third part of this is ISO, which is, okay, what is ISO? So ISO stands for the International Organization for Standardization, or if you say that in French, it's ISO instead of iOS. There's really not a unified measurement of ISO. Different manufacturers use slightly different scales. And where this is controlled, and if you think back to that original statement that I made, which is ISO controls the sensitivity of the sensor, it really doesn't. What it is, it's this amplifier that comes after the sensor sends its data downstream. And it's like a stereo amplifier. If you turn it up, you get more noise. So we take a look at this graph, which graphs ISO from left to right and noise from up and down. And it's really a straight line graph. The more you turn up the ISO, the more it affects the noise. The more noise you get, you're adding more electronic noise to the image. So we know we can fix this in post-processing. So why don't we simply increase ISO? Well, first of all, you get some loss of detail. And I'll talk about that later. And secondly, you get some loss of dynamic range. So this is the dynamic range. So my camera has 12 or 14 stops of dynamic range, meaning from the range that it captures from darks to lights. But if I go up to 6400 ISO, all of a sudden my dynamic range gets cuts in half. So the higher ISO I turn, the higher I turn my ISO, the less dynamic range. Now, why is that? So let's say we turn our ISO up, but we still have control over aperture and shutter. So we turn the ISO up, but now we are looking at our camera and we're adjusting the shutter and ISO so we don't blow out the whites. Because blowing out the whites, there's a finite line there. We go too far and we get blown out whites. So what ends up happening is we turn up the amplifier. What we're doing is we're amplifying the darks. And by amplifying the darks, what we're doing here is we're decreasing this and decreasing the dynamic range that we can capture. So the effect of turning ISO up is there is an effect on dynamic range. We as photographers can choose what dynamic range to capture. We can capture the brights or we can capture the darks. If we try and capture the darks by boosting total exposure, the brights will be completely blown out. So we can work on aperture or longer shutter speed, so reducing the depth of field or introducing some blur to let in more photons. But again, we don't want to blow out the highlights. So there's a limitation on how far we go on the brights. And then finally in this path, we are going to want to, because it's a computer, we want to convert this analog signal that we have to a digital output so we can save it as a digital file. A computer is merely a circuit. The circuit's either open or closed. And so we end up having to round this analog signal either up or down to where we can go to. So for instance, here, we have this analog signal, and we need to either choose to make it to go up or to go down. And that's the only choices we have as a computer to do this rounding, to turn something into ones and zeros. So if the signal happens to be close to the noise area, going down to a zero closed circuit, we end up down into the noise area. We start seeing more noise. And here's what we're talking about with rounding. So let's say we have a color and we're arbitrarily call like one color 507 and the second color 493. So a JPEG image, to round, if our choices are 1000 or 0, that 507 becomes 1000 and the 493 becomes a 0. And all of a sudden we see this huge range of what we have captured. On the other hand, we take a raw image, and now with so many more choices to choose from, we have a much closer, much more accurate representation of this color on our card. So this comes back to JPEG or RAW. So a JPEG image is 8 bits. We've taken 8 bits of information. That represents 256 colors per channel, or 16 million combinations. A 14-bit raw image, we have 4 trillion combinations. So this is kind of how this looks. The higher bit image of a raw image, we get so many more choices as we're rounding up or rounding down. We don't necessarily need to round down into the noise. Where in the JPEG image, because you have fewer choices, you're far more likely to round that down into the noise, and that's going to be what you capture on your card. So in Lightroom, it really doesn't, I mean, a raw image is so much larger than a JPEG image, but on the other hand, memory is so cheap these days. If you're using Lightroom or another processing program, it really doesn't matter to capture a raw image, because if you go here to Profiles under Basic, you can tell tell Lightroom to just use the same camera matching profile that you see in the back of the camera on your JPEG, and it just makes it easy to process a 14-bit raw image the same way you'd process a 8-bit JPEG image, except you don't have those wide variations. You're going to have less noise in the image. You have more choices to have a more accurate representation. So what we've learned here as photographers is shoot raw, expose to the right, so we catch more photons. Don't fixate on ISO. We can fix that in post, but you can't fix blur. So get the shot. And then the main trade-off of high ISO is lower dynamic range. So allow me to jump in here with an update. I'm going to blow your mind with a couple of things. First of all, we're going to talk about ISO invariance. And secondly, dual base ISO. Oh, gosh, what is that? So ISO invariance means that the sensor doesn't really care what ISO setting you use. You can recover that data in post instead of increasing the ISO in camera. So here on the left is an image that was taken at ISO 400 and increased 4 stops in post. And on the right side, you have an image that was taken at ISO 6400 in camera. And as you can see, there's almost no difference between them. The takeaway from this is you can boost exposure in camera by turning the ISO up, the amplifier up, or you can boost exposure in post later, as long as you can brighten the image enough in your camera to see what you're shooting. Now, some camera manufacturers claim that they are better suited to optimize for ISO in their own cameras rather than using a third-party program such as Lightroom to increase your exposure there. Now, these are cameras that have known ISO invariant sensors. I'm going to pause for a second here so you can see if you can identify your own camera here. And the second concept we're going to talk about is dual base ISO. Now, what does that mean? That means in some cameras, you have 2 circuits, 2 different amplifiers. One amplifier is optimized for low ISO settings, and the other amplifier is optimized for high ISO settings, and it switches automatically in camera. Now, what does this mean for you practically? What this means practically is if you're setting your ISO rather than using auto ISO like I do, but if you're setting your camera for ISO, if you can see here in this area that has the yellow rectangle, those noise levels are actually higher than noise levels from 400 to 1600. So what does this mean? It means if I'm wanting to capture a little more light and I'm concerned about noise, I may choose to set an ISO of, let's say, 900 or 1,000 instead of shooting with an ISO that is 380 to 400 because I'm going to end up with less noise. Now, I may still end up with a little less, as we talked about, a little less dynamic range, but I'm going to end up with less noise in that image. So there's a practical trade-off here. And as you can see, many cameras, Canon, Nikon, Sony, all effectively have this same dual base ISO profile. And if you want to find out what your camera, how your camera relates, you go to this website called photonstophotos.net, and you can look up your camera on this. Okay, let's look at denoise. Now we now understand where noise comes from. We understand how it affects our cameras, how our cameras deal with it. How do we deal with this in post-processing? So if you look up denoise, there are a zillion ways of algorithms that are used to do this, but effectively they all do the same thing. They use machine learning. Adobe trains its computers to look at millions of high noise and low noise patches to figure out through AI where they want to go with this. And if, in fact, in practice, what happens is it looks for those and it looks for pixels next to the pixels you're working on and looks to those for context of what it should do to pixels that it deems high noise. In regular denoise, I'll show you there's sliders in Lightroom and other processing programs. The more specialized programs like Topaz, Lightroom, Adobe Camera Raw, which is the same thing as Lightroom. There are workflows that utilize masking, like Topaz, where you can go through Photoshop to do denoise. Focus today is on Lightroom's ACR, specialized denoise. All these programs are excellent. They all do a great job. I happen to use Lightroom. Doug uses Topaz's new photo AI. I've used Topaz denoise AI. They all work great. In Lightroom, we have a choice. There's two kinds of noise. There's luminance noise and color noise. Topaz actually has sliders to work on both of those. In Adobe, they only have one slider in their their AI noise reduction program, but it does both luminance and color noise. And so if you're using manual and anywhere up to 1,000 ISO, I'm probably using manual denoise reduction. If I go above that, I'm going to go. This picture was taken with my Sony A1 at 6400 ISO. And I am going to, and if you look at this, it's really, really noisy, especially in the darks, but also in interface as well. And I'm going to go here to this denoise button, which is Sony's denoise. Now, when I denoise an image, it is the very first thing I do. And the reason for that is, if there's noise in my image, things like sharpen, dehaze, curves, texture, clarity, and contrast all work on edges in the photograph, and I don't want to sharpen the edges of my noise. So the very first thing I do in a photograph after I decide to keep it is I work on denoise. So I hit the denoise button and it brings up this slider. And because I know that the noise that I'm most likely to see is in the darks, not the lights, what I do is I bring up an area, usually a face, that has some of the background next to it, and I move the slider to the right until all the noise in the darks disappears. Then I hit the Enhance button, and I get this. It takes about 40 seconds on my particular computer to process an image. What I do is I batch process my images. So for dance photography like this, I probably shot 1,500 images, got them down to 200. Of my 200 images, 150 of them were probably at ISO 6400. and the other were a mixture of lower ISO numbers. So I go to the metadata in the library module, I sort by 6400, and I process all my 60. I take one of them, I get rid of the noise in it, and then I process all of those 150 images at once, and I go have dinner, and by the time I get back, they're all done. And I do the same thing with the ISO 5000, ISO 4000, et cetera. And then once I'm done with that, then I go ahead and do all my other edits to the photograph. I can take out the spots in the floor, I can crop, I can do all sorts of other things, and I get my finished image like this. And then every so often, the color noise, usually it's the color noise, is just so bad, or the color cast is so bad that I just can't work with it, and then I'll go black and white. This image actually ended up as 2 different months image of the night in projected, one from Doug, who's standing 2 feet to my right, and one for me. They both won image of the month in our club. But this was taken at ISO 12,500. Choreography was by a particular choreographer who is allergic to light. And then this is where I got most of my information. So if you're looking, you can do searches on YouTube about ISO, searches on YouTube about noise reduction. These are 3 good places to start.